Lecture 62, Jane Austen.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So begins Pride and Prejudice, probably the best-known novel written by Jane Austen. Like the first sip of a fine wine, the first sentence of Pride and Prejudice lingers on the palate with a tingling sensation, subtly provoking and surprising us the more we think about it. Ostensibly, the sentence is about a man and what he wants. Since the object of his want, of his desire or need, is a wife, we might see this sentence as a very simple way of initiating an old-fashioned romance, the story of a man who seeks a woman and eventually finds and marries her. Think of what happens to Cinderella when she's whisked off to the ball by her fairy godmother. The handsome prince falls in love with Cinderella, picks up the glass slipper that she loses in her rush to leave the ball by midnight, searches the kingdom until he finds the delicate foot that will fit that slipper, and then, of course, marries her. But the very first sentence of Pride and Prejudice begins to tell us that this will be a very different kind of story. For one thing, the man in question need not be a prince, let alone a handsome prince. He just has to be single and possessed of good fortune, owning property, or rich enough to buy it. In other words, the sentence tells us that we are no longer in the world of fairy tales, or what used to be called romances, stories of knights rescuing damsels in distress. We are rather in the world of the English novel, which is commonly thought to have begun with Samuel Richardson's Pamela in 1740. As a literary form, the novel inherits from romance the theme of the passionate quest. But it radically revises that theme in light of the socio-economic conditions under which men and women meet and mate in the 18th and 19th centuries. Pride and Prejudice, like most of the other novels published in the 70-odd years since Pamela appeared, tells a story about characters situated in realistic time and space and operating under conditions that we recognize even now, 200 years later, as realistic. Say what you will about the ecstasy of falling in love and running away and living happily ever after, the plain fact is that unless the happy couple plan to live on the street and beg for spare change, marriage normally takes a certain amount of cash, property, or both. In Jane Austen's time, a genteel young woman could not work for a living, and therefore could not expect to live comfortably unless she was lucky enough to inherit money or marry it. So in the first sentence of Pride and Prejudice, the word want is charged with several meanings. If a single man possessed of good fortune is in want of a wife, he is in the market for a wife. He wants a wife in the way he might want a house, a butler, or a horse. Here, too, we see how the old-fashioned plot of romance, which is driven by the man's passionate quest for a woman, gets reconfigured in terms of business and acquisition. This doesn't mean that desire disappears as a motive for marriage, because a man with a lot of money has the power to choose from a variety of young women. But there remains a crucial question. Will the woman that he wants want him in return? And in what sense will she want him? Will she truly desire him? Or will she simply need his money to live on? Jane Austen understood this question only too well. In 1801, when her father retired as rector of the Anglican Church in Steventon, Hampshire, she moved with him and her mother and her sister Cassandra to the town of Bath, as the English say, where they lived in rented lodgings on a tight budget. In December 1802, when she was almost 27 and therefore well on her way to spinsterhood by the standards of her day, she got a proposal from a young man named Harris Big Wither, heir to a magnificent estate called Manydown Park. There was just one problem. Besides being 6 years younger than Jane, Harris Big Wither, what a name, was a witless, stuttering, shambling, clumsy dolt, the worst possible mate for a witty, sophisticated, playful young woman. So what did Jane Austen do? At first she said yes, which meant, of course, yes to the irresistible attractions of his magnificent estate. Then she spent a sleepless night and told him no. Not even his splendid estate could trump her indifference, her downright aversion to him. 3 years later came a second proposal from a lively young clergyman who was far more engaging than Harris Bigwither. But he was too young and impulsive and lacking in fortune to tempt her. So Jane Austen stayed unmarried right up to her death at the age of 42. Nevertheless, she knew very well how much a young unmarried woman could want a suitable husband, for that is the very want lurking just beneath the surface of the sentence about the wants of a single man. At the age of 20, before any proposals had come her way, she fell in love with a handsome young Irishman whose wit and boldness and sense of play matched her own. But since neither of the two had any money to speak of at the time, his family packed him off to London and left her nursing a broken heart. Out of that broken heart, plus a great deal further experience of the infinitely complex relations between marriage, money, and property, out of all that came the novels of Jane Austen. Though the great opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice seems to be talking about the wants of a single man, it is written from the viewpoint of a single woman looking out for marriage prospects, a woman who very much needs a single man possessed of a good fortune, and ideally of some personal attractions as well. But how does she get such a man? By romantic or fairy tale convention, the woman is the passive object of the man's passionate quest. She waits for him to find her and make his proposal. But Jane Austen knew very well that women who did absolutely nothing but wait might end up waiting forever. Socially forbidden to pursue any man openly, most women were compelled by economic need to become man hunters, to find men capable of supporting them, and often to settle for the best deal they could make with a man who was anything but Prince Charming. Operating under these radically contradictory rules, what could a young woman do? What were her options? Did she have any reasonable chance of ensuring her financial security and of finding a compatible mate? These are the thorny questions that Jane Austen tackles in her fiction, and above all, in Pride and Prejudice, which strives to tell, as unsentimentally as possible, just how two young women of very modest means contrive to captivate two handsome and wealthy young men. So the leading roles in this novel are played by women, not by men, but by women, especially by one young woman, Elizabeth Bennet. 20 years old, she's the second of the 5 daughters of a gentleman who can support them and his wife modestly for as long as he lives, but who cannot even leave them the house they live in. For by the English law of the time, their estate is entailed, legally predestined to go out of the Bennet family to the nearest male heir. This is why Mrs. Bennet wants so desperately to get her daughters married. Now let's talk about Mrs. Bennet. She strikes most readers as hopelessly stupid and overbearing, irrepressibly garrulous, vulgar, and anything but subtle in her hunt for eligible men. She's a source of acute embarrassment to her daughter Elizabeth, especially during supper at the Netherfield ball, where Mrs. Bennet freely and openly boasts of her expectation that her eldest daughter Jane will soon be married to Mr. Bingley, the rich and handsome young bachelor who has recently moved into their neighborhood and is giving the ball at his house. Elizabeth is especially embarrassed because her mother's vulgar boasting is clearly overheard by Mr. Darcy, the fabulously rich and handsome bachelor who has already begun to interest Elizabeth. But the irony of this whole scene becomes evident when we realize that just before Mrs. Bennet starts boasting about Jane's marriage to Bingley, Elizabeth herself has been happily thinking about it. Mrs. Bennet breaks the social rules by taking the lid off Elizabeth's thoughts, by talking about the manhunt in which all the Bennet women are engaged. That's what makes her so vulgar. But in her own bumbling way, Mrs. Bennet exposes the radical contradiction under which young single women live. While desperately hunting eligible men, they must pretend to be doing nothing of the kind. This sharp conflict between social ritual and brute economic fact comes to a head when the Bennet household is invaded by Mr. Collins. Early in the novel, Mr. Bennet announces that he's received a letter from this man, a distant cousin who has never met any of the Bennets before, but has written to say that he now plans to stay with them for a couple of weeks. But Collins is not only Mr. Bennet's cousin. By the law of entailment, he's the heir to the Bennets' property. And when I am dead, Mr. Bennet says, Collins may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. Mr. Bennet's tone is typically cavalier and facetious. He's far more attractive than the deadly serious Mrs. Bennet because he has such a wonderfully light touch, the delightful ability to make a joke out of anything and everything. When I'm dead, you'll all be out on the street. What a riot! What a hoot! But lurking beneath Mr. Bennet's charming joke is an almost brutal indifference to the fate of his daughters. As long as I have my as long as I have my 3 square meals a day and plenty of time to read in my library, his favorite pastime, why should I care what happens to you after I'm dead? It's Mrs. Bennet, vulgar, boorish, utterly lacking in wit, charm, and social graces. It's Mrs. Bennet who cares about those daughters. It's Mrs. Bennet who has every reason to be deadly serious in her anxiety for their future. Because when Mr. Bennet lies comfortably in his grave, they may end up with almost nothing to live on. This brute economic fact, the fact that every one of the Bennet daughters must find and marry a man capable of supporting her, is one of the many things that make this novel realistic. And it's important to realize that brute economic facts constitute much of the core of this novel, because it can too easily be read as the story of genteel families living in a rural neighborhood far removed from the strains and pressures of ordinary life, from the sufferings of ordinary people, or from the high drama of great public events. Jane Austen once described her work as a little bit of ivory, 2 inches wide, not a great canvas, but a finely wrought cameo. Think for a minute about what this novel excludes. It has virtually nothing to say about what we commonly call the business of life, the ways in which people make a living. And it has virtually nothing to say about something else that plays a central role in history, then as now, namely war. Just think about what was happening in England in 1813 when Jane Austen published Pride and Prejudice. England was at war with France, and specifically with the Napoleonic Empire, which by now had overthrown most of the monarchies of Europe. 2 years after this novel appeared, Napoleon was decisively defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by the English Duke of Wellington leading an alliance of European armies against him. But you'd hardly know any of this from Pride and Prejudice. For this is a wartime novel with no war in it. With all its social battles and struggles and triumphs and defeats, the whole story of courtship and matchmaking was quite enough for Jane Austen. While her older brothers went to sea, fought in battles, played their parts on the stage of public history, and thought of novels as merely food for women, she, in turn, thought of public history as food for overstuffed men. Playfully pretending to regret the lack of history in her novel, she told her sister Cassandra in a famous letter, "The work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter of sense, if it could be had, if not, of solemn specious nonsense about something unconnected with the story, an essay on writing or the history of Bonaparte or anything that would form a contrast." End quote. In fact, of course, Jane Austen would never put such stuff into her novel because she had set out to cultivate her own turf, her own home ground, the domestic life of rural England. Consider what she does with war in this novel. Early on, we learn that a militia regiment has been stationed in Meryton, a market town just a mile from the village of Longbourn, where the Bennets live. We also learn that the 2 youngest Bennet girls love to go to Meryton as often as they can to meet the officers. But the officers in this novel are never shown leading men into battle. Instead, they are caught up in social events. In the very last sentence of chapter 12, we get the latest news of the regiment as reported by the young Bennet girls. Several of the officers had dined lately with the girls' uncle. A private had been flogged, and it had actually been hinted that Colonel Forster was going to be married. with just a passing glance at the brutality of war and the flogging of that poor private. The sentence tells us what the officers mainly do. They go to dinner parties, they meet women, and they sometimes marry them, as Colonel Forster does later on. The very last word of the chapter is married, for marriage or mating is the central business of the novel. And if you think this makes the novel trivial or irrelevant to the real business of life, ask yourself whether or not marriage is more important than war in your own life. Ask yourself just how important it is for anyone to choose a marriage partner for the rest of his or her life. This is a novel about that process, the process of finding a partner, a novel about courtship. Courtship is normally the subject of romantic or sentimental fiction, stories of passion. But by the age of 38, when she published Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen had long since learned how to laugh at sentimentality and the conventional language of courtship. The pompous, witless, and utterly insensitive Mr. Collins speaks this language with a vengeance. In proposing to Elizabeth, he tells her of the violence of my affection. But since he also tells her that he's making this proposal for reasons quite distinct from her personal attractions, and that he knows exactly how little she will inherit, he plainly shows that he cares nothing about her at all. So here is the first real test of Elizabeth's character. On the one hand, she's offered a chance to marry a clergyman with a good living, as the English say, a good job as the rector of a country church, with not only a nice rectory to live in, but the certain prospect of inheriting the Bennet's estate once Mr. Bennet dies. Mr. Collins, in short, offers a lifetime of financial security. But on the other hand, he's a pompous, overbearing fool, inviting himself to stay with the Bennets in order to take one of the daughters as his wife. He offers himself to Elizabeth as if she could not possibly refuse him. But she does, decisively. And when he won't take no for an answer, when he warns her that she might never get another chance to marry anyone at all, she says something very remarkable about her refusal to marry him. My feelings in every respect forbid it. Her feelings forbid her to accept his proposal because he has shown no feeling at all, no sensitivity to her feelings. Collins is in fact a grotesque parody of the traditional romantic hero. In traditional romance, a knight in shining armor sets out to rescue a lady in distress. Collins is the modern equivalent of the medieval knight. He's come to rescue Elizabeth from poverty by marrying her so that along with him she can keep the house she now lives in. But Collins utterly fails in the role of lover because he cares nothing at all for the woman that he claims to love. Just 3 days after Elizabeth turns him down, he proposes to her friend Charlotte Lucas, aged 27, just the age at which Jane Austen herself was offered the chance to marry the dolt with the splendid estate. Collins offers no more than a comfortable home, and he falls far short of sweeping Charlotte off her feet, for she knows full well that he's a crashing bore. But unlike Elizabeth, and unlike Jane Austen too, Charlotte accepts a man whom she does not love. She's aging, she's never been very attractive, and though well-educated, she's never been raised to support herself. As a woman of small fortune, she needs financial security, and marriage, she thinks, will be her preservative from want. She must have a husband, and she takes what seems to be the only one available. She makes the choice that could easily have been made by Elizabeth if only she had ignored her feelings for the sake of financial security. Pride and Prejudice is a novel in 3 volumes, and since Charlotte's acceptance of Collins' proposal comes at the end of volume 1, it parodies the typical ending of the sentimental romance. In a typical romance, lovers who have been passionately seeking each other all through the story finally overcome the obstacles that have separated them, whether fiery dragons or tyrannical elders. The young lovers finally overcome those obstacles and are joined in marriage. But there's absolutely nothing romantic about the marriage of Charlotte and Collins. This marriage, in fact, may seem to confirm what Charlotte Bronte said about Jane Austen. The passions are perfectly unknown to her. Now, it's perfectly true that Jane Austen doesn't give us anything like the kind of wild, tempestuous, rebellious passion that we find in the novels of Charlotte Bronte or her sister Emily. Elizabeth Bennet is no kin to Catherine Earnshaw of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Catherine who starves herself to death rather than live without her beloved Heathcliff. Elizabeth Bennet is not a romantic rebel ruled by the winds of passion alone. Though flattered by the attractions of an attractive and superficially charming young officer named Wickham, she would never dream of running off with him, nor even of marrying him without careful consideration of his financial means. She understands the rules of modern society and the practical necessities of life. But if you think that this means that Elizabeth has no heart at all, let's recall again just why she says no to Colin's proposal. My feelings in every respect forbid it. Elizabeth has feelings and principles. Much as she needs financial security, she will not marry a man that she does not love. In a world dominated by men, the young women of this novel have very little freedom, very little room to maneuver. But because of her feelings, Elizabeth dares to exercise one of the very few rights she has, the right to say no. Her mother is dumbfounded by her refusal of Collins, but Elizabeth holds her ground. She will settle for nothing less than a man she loves. Later on in the novel, her principles are tested once again by a proposal more tempting than what Collins has to offer, far more tempting. This proposal comes from the handsome Mr. Darcy, heir to a magnificent estate with a splendid income besides, by far the grandest man in the whole book. But Darcy has antagonized Elizabeth from the start. At a public dance in Meryton, where she first saw him, she overheard him telling his friend Bingley that Elizabeth was not handsome enough, not attractive enough for him to dance with. He thereby wounded her pride and filled her with prejudice against his pride, whence comes the title of the novel. By the time Darcy makes his proposal, Elizabeth has found more reasons to resent him, more props for her prejudice. For one thing, Wickham has told her that Darcy deprived him of a clerical living that was rightfully his. For another thing, she believes that Darcy yanked his friend Bingley right out of the Bennets' neighborhood simply to block the chance of Bingley's engagement to Elizabeth's sister Jane. On top of all this, Darcy makes his proposal sound insulting to Elizabeth's ears because he insists on expressing his sense of her inferiority, that is, his disdain for the low social status of her family as compared with the lofty position of his own. All this prompts Elizabeth to say no for the second time. But Darcy's proposal differs sharply from Collins' proposal. Besides being much richer than Collins with a grand estate of his own, he's also much more intelligent and sensitive, not at all a pompous fool. Also, unlike Collins, Darcy really does care for Elizabeth. It's precisely his feelings for her, his irrepressible love for her, that overpower his objections to her family. Just as important, he has already begun to show that he admires her vitality and relishes her playful wit, that he's learning how to talk to her. At one point, when Elizabeth is playing the piano at a dinner party, Darcy walks up to watch her perform. When he stands over her so that he can see her full face, she lets him know that she will not be frightened by him. My courage, she says, always rises with every attempt to intimidate me. Instead of apologizing for scaring her as a conventional suitor might, Darcy senses that she's sparring with him, and he jabs right back. You couldn't really think that I wanted to scare you, he says in effect, and then adds, and I quote, I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance long enough to know that you find great enjoyment in occasionally professing opinions which in fact are not your own. At this picture of herself, Elizabeth laughs heartily, with a little shock of self-recognition. For all his grandeur and supposed haughtiness, Darcy has done what no other man in Elizabeth's life has even tried to do. He has managed to make her laugh at herself. In their spirited conversations with each other, Darcy and Elizabeth gradually lay the foundation of a love not founded on impulse or wild passion, but rather on rational grounds, on mutual respect, admiration, and affection. Insofar as this novel communicates a message about marriage, and it certainly does, its message is that a happy marriage requires real compatibility, not just financial security, but a real meeting of hearts and minds, a spirit of mutual understanding. This is not something that comes all at once, like love at first sight. It must grow in time and it may have to make its way through a thicket of misunderstandings, resentment, and prejudice before it can generate a lasting relationship. When Darcy first proposes to Elizabeth, she scornfully rejects him for what she calls your arrogance, your conceit, your selfish disdain for the feelings of others. I had not known you a month, she says, before I felt you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. Here is Elizabeth at her most heroic. Offered a life of luxury with a grand and handsome man on his magnificent estate, she says no, because she will not sacrifice her self-respect. However much Darcy may love her, she will not marry a man who fails to respect her, who offers his hand as if he were hoisting her up out of the mud. But if this is Elizabeth at her most heroic, her most resolutely self-assertive, it is also Elizabeth at her most prejudiced. She and Darcy both have a lot to learn about themselves and each other. When Darcy sends her a long letter after she rejects him, she gradually sees her prejudice. She discovers that she was wrong to believe Wickham's story about Darcy, that she had misunderstood his motives for separating Bingley from Jane, and that she herself had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd, in her own words. At the same time, Elizabeth's rejection of Darcy shocks him into shedding his arrogance, softening the edge of his pride, and showing Elizabeth how considerately and sensitively he can treat both her and her family. In short, she learns from him how to overcome her prejudice, and he learns from her how to overcome his pride. As a result, his second proposal wins her acceptance. So, what should we make of this ending? I have argued that Pride and Prejudice radically revises the plot of romance in favor of realism, of an unsentimental picture of the business of matchmaking. And a great deal of this novel is in fact anti-romantic, or at least unsentimental, just like its heroine. Yet it just so happens that this playful, skeptical, irreverent, unsentimental young woman ends up with a dream come true, the modern counterpart of the fairy tale prince. Just listen to Mrs. Bennet's reaction to the news of Elizabeth's engagement to Darcy. "Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich and how great you will be! What pin money, what jewels, what carriages you will have, a house in town, everything that is charming." You can laugh at Mrs. Bennet's dizzy delight, but as is so often the case, she speaks a good deal of truth. This is a fairy tale ending, or the kind of ending we typically get in romantic comedy. Consider, too, what Darcy says of himself at the end. "I was proud and selfish," he says to Elizabeth. "By you I was properly humbled." His own words. "By you I was properly humbled." Now, this, of course, is music to Elizabeth's ears, and perhaps to the ears of all women who imagine they are capable of reforming the men in their lives. But the music we hear is the music of romance. Darcy is not only the perfect mate for Elizabeth, he could have been the perfect mate for Jane Austen herself. He's the ideal man she never found in her life. And as Robert Polimas argues, he's the realization of a woman's fantasy, the fantasy that love gives her redemptive power over a man and thus over the world. Proud as he is, Darcy humbly bows to Elizabeth's redemptive power and makes it clear that he will cherish her for precisely what makes her distinctive, her lively mind, her sportive, irreverent wit. No wonder Jane Austen thought of this novel as her darling child, and of Elizabeth as delightful a creature as ever appeared in print. In Elizabeth, she recreates her 20-year-old self, and then creates a man who can finally gratify all of her needs. For all the realism of this novel, for all its unsentimental focus on the business of marriage making, it nonetheless ends on a resoundingly romantic note. Let me conclude here with a note on my own critical perspective in these lectures. As I hope I've demonstrated in the first two, I seek not just to introduce you to an author's life and works, but to scrutinize one major work in particular, to say how it reflects the history and culture of its time, and to explain the artistry that informs it. Above all, I seek to show how each of these authors rewards the reader with the kind of experience that only great literature can provide.